Certainly a joy to be with you this morning and have opportunity to study the life of Jesus. I'm grateful for your health enough to be with us at least. We have several visiting with us, and we're grateful for your presence. We have some family here. Some of that is related to Lee and Laura's dad, Daryl Ratliff. He was in the hospital, and then he went to a rehab facility in Coleman, in the hospital in Coleman, then a rehab for only, 2 days? 3 days. And then the foot seemed to be hot. The one that has had an infection, it seemed to be hot and infected. And so he had to go back in the hospital. And so that's not good. But I think things are going better, at least, than we had originally thought they might go. So appreciate the prayers on his behalf and everybody else for that matter. Glad to have the opportunity to be with each of you. The fellows have given out the second volume, and you'll note it looks just about like the first on the cover, but I have on volume 2, Closing Ministry Through Jesus' Exaltation. It takes us really through Revelation 4 and 5, where Jesus is exalted to God's right hand. Peter, of course, declares that in the 2nd chapter of Acts, that he has been exalted. Speaking of David, he being a prophet, knowing that God had sworn to him with an oath that of the fruit of his loins he would set one upon his throne, he, foreseeing this, spoke of the resurrection of the Christ. So the resurrection, and then his appearances to prove his resurrection, then his exaltation to the right hand of God, where what two offices does he now hold that he actually has dealt with? We hadn't gotten there in the life of Christ. His priesthood and his kingship. He was a king priest, right? But anyway, this goes through all of that, the 12 appearances, and then what we find in Acts 1, Luke 24, the end, and then Revelation 4 and 5. A little more detailed because, there's somebody said about the book of John, it has it's about the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus with a long introduction. And that's partially true. The first 10 chapters down to 11, verse 54 deal with the events preceding, and then 11:55 through the end is Passover. And so you have all those chapters that deal with just a few days and a lot of details given. All right. In our Bible readings, we have finished Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and our readings today were number 208, 209, and 210. The Song of Solomon, Isaiah 1 through 8. That would be our reading schedule. What's the Song of Solomon about in just a sentence or two? Brother Gene, I know we talked about that.
It's a song of Solomon to a woman he loves, expressing his desire for her.
Yes, I think that's it in a nutshell. And there's a lady there who his desire. One of them, at least, does she love Solomon though?
Yeah, she loves the young man.
She loves the young shepherd boy. That's right. But marital love, it seems to be the emphasis there, and the desires and the good things that go with marital bliss, marital relationships. That's the Song of Solomon. And then the first 8 chapters of Isaiah, real briefly, Isaiah 1 through about 39 deals with the impending judgment of what, if I almost question them, what is it, Janet?
Assyria?
It's Assyria is going to be used to judge Israel, the northern 10 tribes. And then 40 through the end is primarily looking toward Judah, and then the judgment of Judah in Babylon, and then their return from captivity. And in the return, I remember Charlie and I talked at length about that there's catapulting ideas of seeing that chart you said you liked, Charlie, that showed It showed like a mountain, and then all the way over it was catapulting into the Messiah's reign. It had really dual applications. But in the first chapter, let's turn real quickly to Isaiah. In those first 39 chapters, he deals primarily with the fact that the northern kingdom of Israel was spiritually bankrupt. And it doesn't have to be that way, but I notice in verse 10 of chapter 1, what did he call the northern kingdom? Same thing as what? Sodom. Yeah, called them Sodom. And they were temple trampers. They were just going through the motion, 11 through about 15. However, could they still change in verse 16? Wash, make you clean. Put away the evil. Cease to do evil. Learn to do well. Seek justice. Relieve the oppressed. Judge the fatherless. Plead for the widow. Those are those constant refrains through the prophets? They really are. And and then in verses 18 through 20, those are probably the most well-known passages in Isaiah. Come now and let us what? Reason together, saith the Lord. Though your sins be as scarlet, they shall be as white as snow. They can be, but you'll have to make some changes. And then so in chapter 2, he pictures the future. In the last days or latter days, verse 2, that the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established on the top of the mountains and shall be exalted above the hills. All nations shall flow in it. It speaks of what? The church, the Messianic kingdom. That's exactly right. In chapter 3, he goes back to the time in which they were living and shows the corrupt nature of their leaders. In chapter 4, verse 2, we have a Messianic passage. In that day shall the branch of Jehovah be beautiful and glorious, and the fruit of the land shall be excellent. And those in verse 3, the middle part, they shall be called holy, even every one that is written among the living in Jerusalem. He's speaking of what there? Again, the church, the Messianic kingdom. Woes are pronounced in chapter 5. And then in 6 is almost an introduction. We have a time period designated in verse 1. In the year that King Uzziah died, and then Isaiah says, I saw the Lord sitting upon his throne. Do you have a marginal reading as to what year Uzziah died? 740. Good, David. 740 BC. So you can pretty much date Isaiah probably 750, 751 to about 722. And Isaiah sees some form of the Lord, and this really, I think this is so reflective of how all of us would be if we saw the glory of the Lord. We see ourselves as little and insignificant. Look at verse 6. When he gives this beautiful picture of what he's seeing, and then said I, what? Verse 5. Woe is me. Yeah, I'm nothing. I'm undone. I'm a man of unclean lips and dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips. Even though Isaiah was not like his people, he felt like his people because of the holiness of God. And so then we see the point that the Lord makes. One of the seraphim, having a live coal, took it and from the tongs of the altar, touched my mouth, and said, your iniquity is taken away, your sins forgiven. And the Lord said, whom shall I send, and who will go for us? And Isaiah, to his credit, says, Lord, here I am, send me. We have a beautiful song that I so enjoy singing. Lord, send me. And he said, go tell the people. And yet, as you tell them, they're not going to listen. They're not going to see, except they hear with their ears, see with their eyes, and understand with their heart and be converted. Unless all those things happen, they won't be healed. In fact, you go ahead and preach to them until what happens, verse 11. Exactly. And would that happen? That would happen. They would go into captivity about 722. In chapter 7, we have the days of Ahaz, the son of Jotham, son of Uzziah, that Rezin, king of Syria, and Pekah went up to Jerusalem to war against it. So we have Isaiah's declaration to Ahaz down in verse 14 that had a primary application, but a secondary referred to Jesus. And what is it? That he would be born of a virgin. Close time then extended with the Lord himself. And then the 8th chapter, in essence, what is stated there in just a nutshell. Who is to be feared?
Syria.
Well, the Lord rather than Assyria, because what's going to happen to Assyria? Yes, they'll eventually be judged, but they're going to judge you. Look at verse 14, quoted in the New Testament. He shall be for a sanctuary, but for a stone of stumbling and rock of offense to both the house of Israel, for a gin and a snare to the inhabitants of Jerusalem. Who would be the stone of stumbling and rock of offense? Jesus Christ. And Peter uses that. He's a stone of stumbling for those who are wicked and don't want to come to him. But for those of us who believe, he is the stone which the builders rejected, and the same was made the head of the corner. And it's beautiful, as he said in 1 Peter, the 2nd chapter. All right. Comment, question? David, looked like you wanted to say something. All right. Let's go then in our study of the life of Jesus. And I wanted us to briefly go back and think about where we've been. In the study of the life of Jesus, we have snapshots, if you please, of his life. Not a history of every event he ever accomplished, because John said if that were the case, the world itself would not contain the books that would contain the things written in it. But enough to show us that he is the Christ of God and he's deity. So in the first section, we have the years of preparation, about 30. And the birth of John, Jesus, early work of John. And then the second major event, or second section rather, deals with the beginning ministry, which, well, always remember, it began with God's announcing, "This is my beloved Son in whom I'm well pleased." What event? His baptism. Then he immediately goes into the wilderness of Judea over here where he's tempted. And then he comes over into Jerusalem where John is, and we have those early disciples, 5 of them mentioned in John 1. First miracle at Cana that is specific. He knew the thoughts of Nathanael, did he not? I saw you before when you were under the fig tree. There are other miracles, but recorded. Specific. The first miracle in Cana, then he goes to Capernaum, back to Jerusalem where he cleanses the temple. The interview with Nicodemus. And then John is in prison, so he needs to go north. And so we have the beginning of the Galilean ministry. He goes to Cana, where he heals a nobleman's son in Capernaum, rejected at Nazareth, moves to Capernaum, makes it his headquarters. And then those 4 disciples that he had been following, but he says, "You keep following me and I'll make you fishers of men." And so then the miracles continue. And some of them, miracles of healing on like the lame man in Jerusalem on the Passover on the Sabbath day. And so that put him in hot water with some of the scribes and Pharisees. Stories in Matthew and Luke we've dealt with. And then eventually he calls the 12 and gives them power to cast out demons and so on. And they do, and they come back and said, even the demons are subject to us. And yet, most of the people were following him for wrong reasons. And so he begins to withdraw from the crowds. And we've been talking about that, how the term either withdraw or left them to get away. And we've looked at the first retirement where he goes to Bethsaida, feeds the 5,000, and then goes across. Well, he tells the disciples to go back across the sea while he goes into the mountain to pray. And he sends the others away. And then on the way, they get in a struggle with the waves, and Jesus comes to them, and how's he coming to them? Walking on the water. Who wants to go to him? Peter, and we have that event. Then he goes to Capernaum, where he gives the "I am the bread of life" speech in John the 6th chapter. And then scribes and Pharisees come from Jerusalem to try to counter his influence, Matthew 15. And that's where he deals with the fact that, remember, they said, you and your disciples transgress the what? traditions of the elders. And Jesus said, you make void the word of God because of your traditions. He dealt with them. Then the second retirement, he goes up through Tyre and heals the Syrophoenician woman's daughter. Good. Let's see. Come on. Here we go. Yes. And likely at Tyre. Then it just mentions that he came from Sidon. He leaves that area and he goes back through Decapolis, where he feeds the 4,000, heals a number who were sick. And then after that, he goes across the sea to Dalmanutha. And then he's engaged by the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and scribes, and say, you just show us a sign from heaven. Yeah, we'll have different disposition. And he said, there's no sign that will be given to you except the sign of Jonah the prophet. And then he leaves there, and he starts to go up toward Dalmanutha. And on the way, he's just, the apostles have been hearing all this debating back and forth. He says, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees. It's we must have forgotten to bring bread. So he says, no, I'm telling you, they have finally understood he's talking about their teaching. He goes to Bethsaida and he heals a fellow who had a what? Or was a problem with his, who, what?
Can't speak.
No, not yet. He eyes, he was blind. And he heals him in a very distinct way there. He goes to Caesarea Philippi, where we got the announcement of the establishment of the church. And also he predicts his death and his resurrection very plainly. Then he leaves there and goes to where? Mount Hermon, where he's transfigured before them. And before Peter, James, and John. Moses and Elijah speaking with him about his decease that was to be accomplished in Jerusalem. He comes down the mount, and that's where Brother Gene was thinking about. Coming down the mount, they talk about Elijah. Let's see, where are we? Here we go. Coming down from the mount, they talk about Elijah. They didn't understand that. Then when they get down, this man has a boy, a son, who was really in a bad shape. Epileptic, seizures, convulsions, be thrown in the fire and water, foaming at the mouth and all that. And so Jesus casts out the demon, he's made whole, and then condemns the apostles for their lack of faith. All right, then they come on down toward Capernaum, and several things are happening now. On their way, he predicts his death a second time very plainly, and you tell me, what are they arguing about as they're coming down on the way? Who's going to be number one? That's right. But when they get there to Capernaum, Peter is asked about Jesus paying the half shekel. And so the miracle occurs there. Jesus tells Peter, go into the sea and what? Cast your hook in. First fish that comes out, you'll have a shekel pay for you and me. And then, during that time, they've been arguing over who is the greatest. And in Mark's account, and Luke mentions it, John is jealous over another disciple who's able to do what? He's not an apostle. He's able to cast out demons. And John said, Lord, forbid this fellow from doing that. He's not following with us. And Jesus said, he's one of us. He's just not among you, the apostles. And so that really is the background. They're arguing over who's number one in the kingdom. And this exclusivity. He's not one of us, so just keep, put him out. And Jesus said in Matthew and in Mark's account, except you receive such a one as, my little children, you won't be a part of the kingdom. It ends, this section of the withdrawals ends when his brothers advise him to go to Judea and show himself to the world. But we haven't finished our questions. I have some notes that are not in the booklet that I wanted to share with you about some of these passages in Matthew 18. All right, let's turn to Matthew 18, guys. Matthew 18. You want to remember, Mark 9 is your passage for the most exhaustive background as to the instructions given in Matthew 18. Now, in Matthew 18, in the first 6 verses, I take it that he's primarily dealing with this immediate difficulty the apostles are arguing over who's going to be greatest in the kingdom. And then you have even the apostle John, who in Mark 9:38-40 said, tell this fellow not to do this. He's not one of us. And so this idea of excluding genuine, we're not talking about people that need to be withdrawn from, but genuine disciples that we might exclude, and then also the pride. Really, it was a pride problem. And so he deals with that and says, except you be converted or turn, verse 3. Oh, by the way, and he takes us an object lesson, a little what? A little child. Takes him up in his arms. And he says, except you turn and become as little children, you will not inherit or enter the kingdom of heaven. And then humbling oneself in verse 4 as this little child. Verse 5, receiving one such little child in my name. And he says, if you don't do that, it would be better for you what? To be drowned by a great millstone in the depth of the sea. We talked about that. And then in 7-14, he extends from the whole idea of causing people to stumble based on one's pride and excluding genuine disciples. He moves to the idea of a general or a broader idea, and that is you don't say, you don't look, you don't go anywhere that will cause anybody to do what? To stumble. So it's broadened in verses 7-14. And I take it to be, I don't think I made this plain in the notes. I think he's talking about two categories of people. He's talking about ourselves. And I know that's true because he says, verse 8, if your hand or your foot causes you to stumble, you cut it off and cast it from you or from thee. It's good for thee to enter into life maimed or halt rather than having 2 hands or 2 feet to be cast into the eternal fire. And if thine eye causes thee to stumble, your eye, you pluck it out and cast it from thee. It's good for thee to enter into life with 1 eye rather than having 2 eyes to be cast into the hell of fire. But then he mixes and mingles with these ideas, still the idea that you don't do anything that would cause somebody else to, you don't do anything that would cause yourself to be put in a position where you're tempted to sin, and you don't do anything that would cause another person to be tempted to sin. Verse 10, see that ye despise not one of these little ones. And now he's not talking about children, but who?
Young Christians.
Well, or just Christians who have childlike faith, For I say to you that in heaven their angels do always behold the face of my Father who is in heaven. If angels are interested in these people who have childlike faith, you ought to be. So you ought not to do anything. And then he emphasizes that in 12-14. 11 is in some of the translations. For the Son of Man came to save that which was lost. Jesus said, my very mission was to save everybody. And so don't despise anybody. I came to save everybody. And then in 12-14, he illustrates it with the what? Parable of the lost sheep. How many sheep were all together at one point? 100. How many got lost? 1. And what did he do? He left the 99 and went out to find the one that was lost. And what happens in verse 13? He says, if so be that he find it, verily I say unto you, he rejoiceth over it what? More than over the 99 which had not gone astray. Is that parable repeated anywhere? Yes. In the Luke 15, and you have the 100 sheep, the 10 pieces of silver, and the 2 boys, the elder son and the younger son. What was that?
That was me.
Somewhere.
I thought it sounded like a book.
It fell back here.
Oh, okay. Okay, see, good. I'm glad it was you, Sister Violet, not me. I have enough. I go crazy up here sometimes trying to find stuff. Yeah, I lose this thing, and so here it is right here, and I just, miss it by an inch. But anyway, yes, sir.
The part of it we was talking about causing somebody to stumble, isn't that something that's repeated in Romans when Paul's talking about eating meat sacrificed to idols?
Isn't it talking about what, Brother Fairley?
When Paul was talking about meat sacrificed to idols,
Yes.
there may not be anything wrong with the meat, but if it causes somebody.
Yes, that's exactly right. Yeah, that's exactly right. You're not wanting to do, and of course that was associated, obviously with the idolatrous practices. And if my going back, he says in chapter 8, meat's meat. It's not going to commend you to God, but if it causes somebody to stumble, he sees, here's a Christian, he's eating pork or something, he eats beef that's offered in the shamble, bought in the meat market, and he brings it back, and they know, well, that usually is sold in shambles, or the meat market, your version say. That usually was meat that was offered over here next door in the temple of Aphrodite or Apollos or somebody. And so we don't, but this old Brother Joe over here he's eating that, so I can too. And then all of a sudden the fellow who was just recently out of heathenism, he thinks when he's eating it, he's actually eating it in honor to the idols. And so it's kind of a syncretism, a worship of God, worship of idols. And so don't do that. Don't cause anybody. Yes, sir, Josh.
Not meaning to go down a rabbit hole, but I was seeing something where this guy running for political office, he's being criticized, and this has roughly to do with that, for purchasing products that the manufacturer supports some organizations that have to do with the problems we're having nowadays. And he's supposed to be on this righteous pedestal where he's not. We don't have control about, when we go to the grocery store, we're buying from this company. Okay, so they give money to the LGBTQ.
Yeah.
We don't have control over
It's
that,
hard.
but a lot of people
Yeah.
get offended. Oh, you can't buy this product. You know what they do?
Yeah,
You know who they give money to?
right.
What are we to do about something like that? I mean, not me to go down a rabbit hole.
Yeah.
I'm just saying, is it fair on us, or have they got a point?
Maybe I'm inconsistent, but I mean, we use Charter. Well, it's not Charter anymore. Spectrum. We use Spectrum. Well, they give to all kinds of stuff. Well, AT&T does. Who are you going to use for your internet service? Either that, or maybe don't have any at all. There's some things that I don't. Maybe I'm inconsistent, Josh. But there's some companies, I don't know how you almost live life without having to do business with some. But if they're out front with something and you've got a choice, and they are basically in your face, this is what we do, I'd rather go to somebody else. It's hard, to me it's hard to be consistent. It's really hard to be consistent, and entertainment is something that I just about got where but we have cable, so we're paying for it in a bulk rate, I know, and that makes it more difficult, but I know I'm not answering your question because I don't.
It is. I mean,
Yeah, it's difficult. I think it's difficult. Let's turn to 123 in our song books. This is a song that really combines what we're studying here, Matthew 18, 12 through 14, and also the passage in Luke, the 15th chapter. Let's sing it. I know it'll take us just a minute, but I think when you consider the point Jesus is making, especially in verse 14, even so it is the will of your Father that not one, O-N-E, one of these little ones who believe on me should perish. God is interested, and if he's interested in the last one person, so should we. No, so, Jonathan, I'm going to turn this thing off, okay? No, so, there were 99 that safely lay in the shelter of the fold, but one was out on the hills of away on the mountains wild and bare, away from the tender shepherd's care, away from the tender shepherd's care. Lord, thou hast heard thine eye and thine, are they not enough for thee? But the shepherd made answer, this of mine has wandered away from me. And although the road be rough and steep, I go to the desert to find my sheep. I go to the desert to find my sheep. But none of the ransomed ever know how deep were the waters crossed, nor how dark was the night that the Lord passed through, where he found his sheep that was lost. Far out in the desert he heard its cry, 'twas sick and helpless and ready to die, 'twas sick and helpless and ready to die. Lord, whence are those blood drops all the way that march up the mountain's track? They were shed for one who had gone astray, and the shepherd could bring him back. Lord, whence are thy hands so red and torn? They're pierced tonight by many a thorn. They're pierced tonight by many a thorn. But all through the mountains thunder riven, and up from the rocky steep there arose a glad cry to the gate of heaven, rejoice, I have found my sheep. And the angels echoed around the throne, rejoice, for the Lord brings back his own. Rejoice, for the Lord brings back his own. Sat one time, listened to a Dallas Christian choral group sing that song. Ray Walker was leading it. I don't know if you know who Ray Walker is. Sang bass with the Jordanaires. It was so good. And if you have somebody in your family who is there, the sheep that has gone astray, and that picture of the shepherd going out and loves that one sheep, it's as moving as I know how to make it. That's how we feel. If we love our people, love people's souls the way we need to love them, the way the Lord loves them, then it hurts. It hurts. And you want what is best. You know the Lord has gone that thorn-riven way, and we didn't know the waters crossed, the kind of difficult. We know some that the Bible states, more difficulties he endured for you and me. And it gets real personal when you say, I was there. And even those of us who have become Christians and then go back, the Lord still wants us. He loves us. And that song is very special to me. All right. What number did we finish on? It was page 100, was it not? David, you or Patty probably have a, Janet, Eugene. What is it? P at the top of the page. Okay. To illustrate how terrible sins or offenses are. By the way, there are two, the newer translations use the word sin, cause one to sin. Some of the others use the word stumble or offend, and it's from scandalizo, scandal, or it means from which we get scandal. The word sin is really from a different Greek word, and it means basically the same, but it's a different way of getting there. To stumble is you're going okay, and all of a sudden it's almost, and I've got this defined on the next page. It comes from a word that actually meant the bait in a trap. And it's like it's set there for you to, and so that's kind of the idea behind causing to stumble. You're setting a trap for somebody to fall into, whereby they stumble and sin. That's kind of the more picturesque point that it paints. So to illustrate how terrible sins or offenses are, Jesus said it's better to enter into life having severed what 3 body parts and be saved than to retain them and be lost. One's what? Hand, foot, and eye. Yes, the general idea is we deny ourselves whatever would cause us to sin, even if the denial of such would be as painful as the loss of a limb or eye. Hell is so terrible we should avoid it regardless of the cost. Further, Jesus may use these 3 members to represent sins caused by things we do with the hand, where we go, we use our feet to walk, and what we see with the eye. I think that's pretty definite on the foot. Remember in Romans 10, when Paul quoted from Isaiah, he says, "Blessed are the feet of them that bring glad tidings of good things." Yeah, even the feet, they're coming to you with the gospel. Mark's account at this point records an additional description Jesus gave about hell. It's described as fire that shall never be quenched, where their worm does not die and the fire is not quenched, and where everyone will be seasoned or salted with fire. Every sacrifice will be seasoned with salt. If it helps your feelings about any of this, Brother McGarvey said in his fourfold gospel, and I don't have the quote here, we have here one of the most difficult verses in the Bible. I thought, I'm glad he said that. I mentioned in the note, usually salt represents something that preserves another thing from decay. We're reminded in Matthew 5, you're the what of the earth? Salt of the earth, the light of the world. And you know, oftentimes with them, well, salt makes things more palatable, and it does. But salt was used primarily to preserve what? Meats. Yeah, it's a preservative. And that seems like this idea of eternity or preserving someone. It perpetuates things. Jesus had been discussing punishment in hell in a future state. The idea is that a worm that feeds on its host will die once the host has been consumed. A fire burns out eventually when its fuel, when whatever is burning, is consumed. However, in hell, the worm does not die, the fire is not quenched. As salt preserves and perpetuates, so the punishment in hell continues eternally. I think that's the point there. Similar language is in Isaiah 66. But in Mark's account, Mark 9:50, Jesus adds another thought. Every offering presented at the altar had to be seasoned with salt. Jesus seems to give a contrast. Those who do not deny themselves those things that cause them to stumble will be salted with fire, kept eternally in a state of severe pain. On the other hand, those who deny themselves sinful pleasures, or they cut off their hand, foot, or eye, are actually offering themselves to God. They offer their bodies as a living sacrifice, and hence bringing themselves as an offering, they are figuratively salted or seasoned with salt, as were offerings brought to the altar. Those who do this will be preserved unto eternal life. That's about the best I can do on that. It's a difficult passage, but somehow he's making that contrast. Mark 9:50 continues the teaching using the figure of salt. We just alluded to it. Salt is what? It's good, but if the salt loses its flavor, how will you season it? Have salt in yourselves and have what? Peace one with another. Remember the context. What have they been arguing about? Who's going to be first, and excluding certain true disciples. No, let's have peace one with another. Figure of salt is continued, symbolizing perseverance during self-sacrifice. Disciples were to maintain perseverance regardless of whatever sacrifice sacrifice they needed to make. Keep in mind the context. All right, Jesus resumes his warning against pride in Matthew 18 by saying we are not to do what? Don't despise these little ones. What is stated in verse 10 as to why we should not so treat our brethren, which also illustrates God's interest in his humblest child. What was that? God knows it, that's true. But in heaven, their angels do always behold the face of my Father who is in heaven. I had a fairly lengthy note on this. This passage has been used to try to prove guardian angels, angels that guard over you, kind of like in Jimmy Stewart in It's a Wonderful Life with Clarence. Some attempt to prove this, that the Christians, others say young children, have guardian angels. It's helpful to show the difference between fact and fiction. There are some facts we can know. It's true from other passages that angels take an interest in our spiritual welfare. In Luke 15:10, there's more joy in the presence of the angels over one soul that repents than 99 that need no repentance. So you think about there are beings in the heavenly realm who know what is going on. Now that doesn't mean they direct various things, but they know what's going on. And there's joy among these when a person who is away from God comes back to God. There's joy. Yes? What was that? Yeah, Laura said it's like they're rooting for us. That's a good way of looking at it. It's like you got these angelic beings who are on your side. You can do it. Kind of like in Hebrews 12, 1 and 2. Having therefore so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin that does so easily beset us. That you've got all these people who've done it before, you can do it. And here are the angels. So we know that. In 1 Corinthians 11:10, he says, for this cause shall a woman have a sign of authority on her head because of the angels. There have been a lot of talk of, well, what does that mean? Well, whatever it is, it's a reason that she ought to be covered, man uncovered, I believe, according to that passage. But it also gives the idea that angels are concerned about authority and our submission to authority, submission to headship. That's the context. And that could be an idea there. Second, the Bible plainly teaches angels are ministering spirits sent forth to do service for the sake of them that shall inherit salvation. However, if a person says these angels offer some type of special protection, then what would it be? Could they suggest a thought? What about an evil thought? Wrong thoughts that Christians might have? Could they cause a particular action? If so, what about wrong actions on the part of Christians? You go down the slippery slope when you start saying, well, my angel does this, but there's just no evidence for it. Truth is that Matthew 18:10 does not even imply any of those things. It says, see that you despise not one of these little ones, for I say to you that in heaven their angels do always behold the face of my Father who is in heaven. We can therefore safely believe that Jesus tells us not to hold with contempt any humble disciple. The reason is that their angels, who have an interest in their salvation, are in heaven and in the very presence of God. McGarvey concludes his comments on that passage by saying, making it exceedingly preposterous that we should despise. If angels are concerned, how should we, be otherwise? All right, 12 through 14 relates to what Jesus has been saying as to significance of just how many people? One. Keep the whole conversation in context. Of whom does Jesus speak in these verses being cast into eternal fire, hell of fire, going astray, and perishing? Alien sinners or children of God? Children of God. He says this is like the kingdom of heaven. That phrase is used numbers of times. How do you, well, I just answered W. How do you know? Remember the context? He's speaking with, first of all, he's speaking to whom? The apostles. And he's speaking of right relations with them. Causing someone to do what? To stumble, which indicates they're in a right relation to start with. So he's primarily talking about people who are kingdom citizens.
Plus his example was of 100 that was there in one group.
That's right. They're with the shepherd. That's right. One went away from the shepherd. Great point. By the way, I was thinking this, no, I didn't put this in the notes. I was thinking about this last night. That really, if anything teaches once saved, that it's possible for a person once who has been saved to be lost. If any passage teaches it, this is one that does. He obviously shows you can be stumbled and perish and be lost in the hell of fire. How could Jesus have made it any plainer? And then the last one here, verse 14 seems to be the key to the whole chapter. God does not want even how many to perish? One. And that's seen earlier in the fact that we should never hold in contempt any disciple or do anything to cause him to stumble. Why? God is deeply concerned about every individual soul. An illustration of the shepherd leaving his 99 sheep, looking for the one lost sheep, further illustrates that. We're going to have to stop and say this. The rest of the chapter, chapter 18, deals with, okay, you make sure you don't cause a person to stumble. That's 1 through 20. Oh, I'm sorry, 1 through 14. Then 15 through 20, what about when somebody does what? Sins against you. Our responsibility. And then, well, what if he repents? Then 21 through the end, our duty to do what? Forgive. Okay, we'll have to stop there and pick up, Lord willing, Wednesday night with